I know all of you know the stress and the pain in some way or another of being a parent. All of you have been parents. I beg your pardon. You were the stressor, not necessarily the stressee. And the middle child. Oh man, you filled in the picture so much. Oh my. Anyway, I know from your experience with your sister and your nieces and nephews, you see a little up and down there as well. But we can all relate to that. I know a couple of months back I pulled into my favorite store, Home Depot. And as I pulled in, I saw somebody just a few trucks down, and turned out to be a young man. In fact, he's in early midlife now, but he was a I lived in Regina all those years ago, and he grew up with my kids. And so I waved at him, he waved at me. He moved to Edmonton quite a few years ago. I did his wedding. Now he's got kids coming out to be teenagers, and I thought, wow, God, great, fancy seeing him here. And as he was walking over, I glanced down at my phone, and there was a text message. And it was from one of my kids, and he had been accepted into a program that will help him to go forward in life. And we've been anticipating, I've been anticipating and wondering and thinking about this for 2 years. And I just, the sense of relief that I felt reading that text message, which was clearer and more positive than I had been led to believe would be coming my way. Then I'm rolling down the window, and here's Darren, and we're talking, and after a few minutes he asks about his peers, my kids, and I felt again that overwhelming sense of, well, since you ask, I'll tell you. At that particular moment, the sense of relief and the sense of, I'm old-ish. And you never know what will happen to you. And the thought that, well, if I left, what would happen to my kids? What will happen to them in the direction they're going in life? I know, again, recently I was talking to one of my grandchildren, and she had, the youngest one, and she'd been away on an exchange program into an unnamed country in the European way in the East, and had formerly experienced, dominance from the Russian Empire. Let's put it that way. And to be fair, it was a great experience in many ways. She stayed with a beautiful family, but there was a very different attitude towards women in this country. And, she's a small girl, and she's 16, 17, and she's in an exchange program. And first of all, she was not used to, her mom is a high school teacher, and she's used to a positive environment. And so here she is learning a very difficult language, adjusting to an interesting culture, and surprised that both she and the other Canadian kids in this class were subjected to quite a bit of ridicule. If you can't learn, you go back to where you came from. Ooh, ouch. And of course, she has her own personality. She's not a very aggressive young lady, but she got a lot of odd looks because she likes to dress like a Canadian, and she perhaps uses too much makeup because she's a little bit more into the goth scene, things like that, although she's not wearing a lot of studs and leather and everything else. But she looks differently than the kids there. So between the looks, and also, surprisingly, maybe you remember perhaps seeing the Russian premier some years ago. He was famously, caught on film just walking up and goosing Angela Merkel. He thought nothing of giving her a goose. And certainly 50 or 60 years ago, it was kind of almost acceptable on the tube. I say almost acceptable, not really, but if a young lady got her bottom pinched by a man, it wasn't it didn't bring on a screaming fit. If you happened to be bumped up against on the tube or the subway, it didn't bring on a screaming fit. Today in North America, you do that and you'll find yourself charged with sexual assault. If you wolf whistle at a girl, that's not appropriate. And here she is in a culture that reflects values that have gone out of style. some 50 years ago. Just last night I was watching the news, and I think Joe Biden was being taken to task for having inappropriately kissed a woman 5 years ago or something like that. And then they showed the video, and he was being introduced, and they sort of did this, and I thought, that's still acceptable, but he was groveling and apologizing, and will this affect his chances if he declares? All this sort of thing. And so anyway, my little granddaughter had some very unfortunate experiences in that culture, which really caused her then to eventually talk to her mom, and the organization that had facilitated this cultural exchange brought her home. And of course, when she got back to Canada, then I was able to talk with her. I just texted her once or twice when I heard about the distress she was going through. But again, it was a huge relief to be able to talk to the little kid on the phone and say, well, look, you're back home. Nothing came of these things. It's a learning experience. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. All those things Granddad has to say. But it was really upsetting to think that I thought she'd be there into June or July, and was scheduled to take a 3-week tour of Europe. That just got canceled, and she came home, and very distressed. And so, and again, a grandfather in this case, I felt very protective of this little girl, this 17-year-old kid. It's difficult to understand some of those emotions, but when you see kids that are vulnerable or in danger, you can, I think, relate to the overwhelming emotions that if you reach back, you will remember. It's difficult to understand how God feels as a parent, because on the one hand, we think of God as God is spirit. That's how God is omnipresent. God is spirit, and sometimes we think in terms of, like Paul says, begin to understand God in whom we move and live and have our being. I think of that in terms of, may the force be with you. What is the force? It is that thing that binds all living things. What is God? Who is God? He is the source of life from which we all take life. And we are sustained. How do you understand the omnipresent God who is spirit when we are limited and corporeal and fleshly? Well, he has done us the favor, if you will, of stepping into our realm in the person of Jesus the Christ, who is, we are told, in whom dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. But Jesus tries to explain to us the emotions that God has. The emotions that God, who is told to us, He is the Father, the source of life in all of the creation. And you see Him, you understand Him in and me and through me. But even this, I am trying to explain to you, all the way back to the source of life in this universe, who is the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so as we look to Easter, the time when Jesus offers Himself, Jesus Himself tries to tell us how to understand the Father in terms of the feelings that a parent has for a child, or a grandparent, in my case, has for a child. As we continue in the book of Luke, we see this vividly illustrated in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, which contains actually 3 parables, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost child. In this case, we often refer to him as the prodigal son. Somebody asked me, you better be interesting this morning. I need to be able to stay awake. So we'll just, to help that individual, we'll dub the prodigal son simply Gene. And so hopefully that helps. So now, whoever that was, will have a reason to listen. Luke 15 begins, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. He was a fascinating speaker. He was an interesting individual, and if things got dull, he'd feed you. 5 loaves, 2 fishes, 5,000, no problem. So however you looked at him, he drew people to him. The Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." This is a polarized society. You think identity politics is not. In this particular society, tax collectors were, well, that was a buzzword. That was a wolf whistle. That was a way of saying traitor. You are a Jew, and you're working for the occupying Romans. You are a quisling. You are a cooperator with the occupiers. And then sinner is obvious. Sinner is a sinner is a sinner. What's a sinner? Sinner who doesn't act as I lacked. Because I'm me. I'm one of us. And these tax collectors and their sinners, they are them. And ne'er the twain shall meet. Then Jesus told them this parable. Now, when you begin to try to understand parables, you have to realize that they are stories, and they're not taken, quote, too literally. When you start getting real literal with parables, then you start to believe, the kingdom of God will be full of rewards. Some of us will get 2 cities to rule over, some 5. And then, of course, the guy reading the scriptures, surely he reads 8 or 9, even 10. Huh? So, all of you know who you are. You're in the 2 category. Some of you may think you're in the 5 category, and a few of you might even hang with me. We're the top 10. No, parables are stories, and there are quite a few of them, and they are a way of, if you will, walking around the subject. You walk a little bit over here, and you see a different view. Hey, there's an angle there. There's a drop-off here. You walk over the other side, and you see a different view. Wow, there's a different perspective. And look, there's a base on this thing, and there's a wire coming out of it, and wow, there's a glass holder. Things that you see differently when you walk around a subject, and you see differently from on high than you do from down low. And so in this particular parable, it's one of 3 that talks about the lostness of humanity, the lostness that we, at some time or another, experience, that brings us back to the reality that we need this miracle that we call the miracle of experiencing a Passover. Somebody who will rescue us. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property. Now, in this particular culture, if you expected to inherit, in fact, even in our culture, you typically have to wait until what? My kids eventually will inherit something, but they won't inherit it until after I die. So if one of them asked me right now, could I have my share of the estate? I would take that rather personally, because he's almost just saying to me, why don't you just drop dead? Why don't you get lost? Why don't you give me? Now, there may be certain things for estate planning purposes, people too, but in this culture, pretty much in our culture, it's the same way. And in this particular parable, the kingdom of God is like God, who is a father, has given an inheritance to his creation. But it's, you can take it and use it. And God does not particularly hold back. Jesus said, your Father in heaven is very gracious. He calls rain to fall on the just and the unjust. The rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so we seem to be almost on a parallel track for a while. Reminds me of that old song by, anybody remember a guy by the name of Lorne Greene? Oh, okay. Lorne Greene, yeah. Bonanza, Doc Carter. Before that, you're too young to remember it, but I think he was the voice of CBC News during the war. He was actually known as the voice of doom for a while because he announced the bad news. But anyway, he actually, believe it or not, had a #1 hit record. Did you know that? It was in all sorts of places. It's called Ringo. It was a spoken word song that, and I remember the verse that went something like that, because he had rescued this guy who had been shot, and he nursed him back to health. And he said something like this: one day we rode the mountain crest, and he went east and I went west. I took to law and wore a star, and he spread terror near and far with lead and blood. He gained such fame, and through the West they all feared the name of Ringo. 2 guys who travel together the mountain crest, and they go in separate directions. And these 2 brothers apparently do the same. One goes east and one goes west. And one now is to indulge himself. Because we read not long after he gets his inheritance The younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. And when it says a distant country, it's the best explanation I ever read about this was it wasn't a case of going from Israel way over the river to Jordan and far, far away. It was in a context of the father still knew about, could see. It would be like saying that I live on the West End, but I'm very familiar with the downtown core of Edmonton. I know what it's like, seen pictures, been there for concerts, things like that. I also know that there's an area on 97th Street. I haven't been there after dark, but I know about it. I have a dear friend who was a policeman for some years who used to patrol that area. And I read on a regular basis, and I get reports that there are all sorts of, scruffy things, horrible things, negative things that happen in that particular area. If you want to talk about squandering your wealth and your health and your happiness, apparently a lot of that goes on in 97th Street. I'm aware of it even though I live on the West End. And so the father is said to be kind of aware of that. He knows about that in this context. And this kid, he spent everything there was, and a severe famine in that whole country hits, and to be in need. And so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country. Now, if you're talking to Jews, for the chosen people to work for the unchosen people, in their context, in their time and place, would be a real step down. That's just beneath you. You know the attitude the Jews had to the Goyim, the rest, the Gentiles. You got to be watched closely. If you're going to work for me, and if you're lucky enough to do that, I'll let you thrash grain, but I got to keep my eye on you. And if my eye turns away, then everything with arm's reach is just a loss because you have been unsupervised. In this case, a Jew working for a Gentile, you don't get any lower. Oops, you can go one step lower. To the field to herd pigs. That symbol of uncleanness. You can herd the pigs. In fact, let's go one step lower. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating because no one would give him anything. He is absolutely down on his luck. What a shock to the audience to think. I've told you in the times past that I'm not a big fan of pork. Didn't eat it growing up, and I think I've explained to you that that relates in some extent to a trauma that my mom still has a picture of that trauma, actually. I think you can see that in the next slide. There it is. And yes, I had blonde hair and blue eyes when I was a nipper, and that just hurt me for the rest of my life. I leaned forward to be friendly and got smooched by a pig. But on a more serious note, you don't get any lower. You don't get any more desperate. You don't get any more aware of your circumstances than what this kid is in. And it says he came to his senses, and he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you.'" Finding a way back, I'll process the apologies. I'll manage the confrontation, and there will be a confrontation. There will be a confrontation. I'm sure that he at me because I've squandered everything he gave me. I'm sure he's going to need to chasten me. I'm sure I've got it coming. And so it doesn't get any more desperate than this. I'm starving. I'm reduced to groveling in the mud, competing with pigs for these carob pods. It doesn't get any worse than that. What have I got to lose? And so, with a sense of discouragement and depression, he begins to work through it. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Make me a day laborer, so that at the very least, if you're going to go out and you go to the marketplace, we're not as familiar with this, although we do have, instant on-call labor agencies in Edmonton, but if you were, let's say, in Southern California or Arizona or New Mexico, and you went to Home Depot, it's not unusual. In fact, it's very typical, according to some of my friends, to go there and there will be illegal immigrants who've crossed the border from Mexico, and they'll be hanging out in the parking lot. And you walk up and drive up and say, I need two to work on my yard for a day. And they'll hop in the back of your pickup truck, and you can take them, and you can pay cash, and you can get the work done in a real hurry. And so that's what he's saying. When you see me in the parking lot, would you let me hop in the back and at least give me a break? Just give me a day's wages. I know I'm not worthy to be called your son. To be your son implied status, prestige. It implied an inheritance that was coming my way. All sorts of things. But when you have been rolling in the mud, competing for food with a pig, well, let's face it, your self-esteem is pretty much shattered. Even you can't look in the mirror and say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and God darn it, people like me. Because you can see the mud on your face. You can smell yourself. And you know finally that you've been reduced. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Well, I wonder how that is, because this is before, binoculars. The reason his dad sees him a long way off is because his dad is looking. His dad is wanting to hope will come over the horizon. He is, if you will, sitting on the front porch, but he's not rocking away, sipping at lemonade, dozing off in the heat of the day. He is sitting on the edge of his chair, and he is looking for his son. Just as the shepherd is looking for the lost lamb, just as the woman is looking for the lost coin. This is the third in this trilogy that Jesus is using. His father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He didn't say, that little bastard, he left and he squandered everything. I know, I've been hearing the reports. He just walked out, broke his mother's heart, broke my heart. He's sitting there hoping that he will come to himself. And he's filled with compassion. They said the feeling I had when I heard, hey, the little girl's home now was, how was it? By the way, she had the experience of being able to talk to the sponsors of the program, and they want to know how it was, because they couldn't understand why some of those things were happening to some of the students in that distant country. And actually, neither could the host families. But it happens to be a culture that's a little more, women no place, And if we punch your bottom, what's your problem? Things like that. And so she was lucky enough to be treated with compassion and acceptance, and she wasn't treated like a hysterical young girl who just took objection to somebody. But it was understood, no, there's a very different culture in this classroom. We weren't expecting kids to get ridiculed, put down, and we weren't expecting some of our girls to be kind of groped by the president of the local association. It's just kind of icky feel. Don't take it too far. Nothing totally criminal, but a lot kind of off-putting. And so I felt a sense of compassion for this kid, just as I felt a sense of relief when I heard here's another kid who's accepted into a program that's going to help him to navigate forward for the rest of his life. These are the feelings that well up within you. In this case, the father is not only filled with compassion, it says, but he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Now, if I were to walk in here today, and there have been times when, let's say I've come home and how can I say, ripe, if you can relate to that. I remember one guy by the name of Charlie, he was raising pigs. He had a pig farm. But his wife had a routine. After he'd been working out in the pig farm, he could come into the outer room. But she had especially set up a washer and a dryer there. And he had to strip off his clothes and put them in a washer. And then he could put different clothes on, and then he was allowed into the house. That was the routine. There's a sink there that he could wash a little, and that was all there was to it. And in this particular case, the father, it says, runs to meet him. And when it says he kissed him, I think in the original Greek, it says literally, he fell upon his neck. He just put his arms around him and he kissed him. He embraced him. It's the very same, at least according to Greek scholar I listened to once, it's the same expression as you find in the book of Acts, where it talks about the Holy Spirit that fell upon them. It embraced them. It literally did exactly as the Father does to this Son. I want you to note that he doesn't say, whoa, you stink. He could, because after all, he's been rolling around in the mud, competing for food with the pigs. He doesn't restrain himself and say, when you clean yourself up, I'll let you in the house. He does that. Now, by the way, you ladies, if your husband returns home stinking to high heaven, you don't have to do this literally. When I come home and I'm a little ripe, I go directly to the washer and dryer. It's a little disconcerting to see me in my underwear, but anyway, I throw it in the washer and dryer, and then I go get some different clothes, and then I am a little more presentable. But the dad and his attitude is such that he not only is looking from afar, not only is he running towards this kid, but he throws himself upon the kid's neck. He literally fell upon his neck, despite the stench of his circumstance. And of course, the kid responds as he's been programming himself to say, how do I handle this confrontation? Because I know he's going to yell at me. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Wow. How do you feel about failure? Well, it's kind of natural to feel, as I said, it lowers your self-esteem. There's a reality check. If you practice looking in the mirror and you don't see the filth on your face, that's better. But when you see the filth on your face, what can you do? Well, you can wash it. I never forget, many years ago when I was very, very young, and just a few months in ministry, I went to visit a fellow who was living kind of in humble circumstances, he and his wife, and we talked about mistakes he had made financially, and he was really feeling beaten down. But he had made a number of blunders, I suppose, and he wasn't doing very well financially. And we began talking about how things had gone in his life. And the big thing he complained about was the fact that he felt he'd been sort of manipulated out of an inheritance. And he explained this. And my empathy sort of built towards the guy. And then I said, I was quite indignant, I suppose. And I said, when did this happen? And he said, 20 years ago. Oh, okay. So you came to an understanding that you were financially failing 20 years ago, and you've perpetuated the same behavior in the same circumstances. Taking responsibility, there is a balance between taking responsibility and, quote, forgiving yourself. Understanding, as this kid does, he understands he's done wrong. He has turned to his father, but he has turned to his father with very, 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 very low expectations. Hopes to sort of get a meal out of the deal. And that's where he's coming from. And so he has to sort of balance his expectations and bring up his understanding of his father and come to an understanding that his dad, okay, you take some responsibility, that's why you turn towards home, but when you turn towards home, do you understand home? Do you understand your father? At this particular point, you'll notice that his dad cuts him off. But the father said to his servants, he just cuts him off. He doesn't, you've got your script prepared. I don't need to hear it. And his response is to his servants, quick, bring the best robe. Now, you can read across this very quickly, but clothes about people in that environment. Today, we don't put near as much emphasis on clothing. If I go to church tomorrow morning in Westlock, I'll probably wear jeans because everybody will be wearing jeans. Today, I am dressed a little bit different because, number one, my wife's out of town, and number two, I dressed myself. And you could say, well, is there any reason you dressed this way? It was the first shirt I found, to be honest. That's all there was. Okay. Is there any reason you chose that tie? It was the top of the pile. I hope it matches. I think it kind of matches the slacks, but that's about it. And it's got a little blue, I guess, so it matches that. But that's about it. You know, it's not. In this particular context, a garment, and not just a garment, a robe, the best robe that we have said everything about a person. Priests were identifiable as priests by their garments. Kings and princes could be identified by their garments. Okay? And furthermore, if you understand the theology that Jesus presents in his illustrations, the garment, especially the wedding garment, is likened to his righteousness. The righteousness I will clothe you with. So the first thing he says is, we're going to cover this stink. We're going to cover this mud. We're going to cover this filth with the righteousness. It's a complete gift. Put him on him. Put a ring on his finger. Now, I'm not wearing any rings today, but I have one ring that identifies myself as married, another ring that identifies myself as a graduate of an institute. And that's about it today. Back then, if you had a ring, it was everything. If you were sealing jars of produce, you put your ring, your imprint, into the wax. If you were making a contract, you put your imprint into the seal. In fact, it said everything. It was a guarantee. It was, the best parallel I could draw would be like your credit card. If I have your imprint on this document, then I know that's your word. And so this kid is being restored in dignity and restored in respect and, if you will, the family line of credit. He is being re-granted that which he squandered in the first. And I find that a very important thing to emphasize, because I know many years ago I listened to a brief presentation by a young man, and he was talking to youth. And he was trying to explain that, yeah, the prodigal son, he gets to come back home, but look what he's lost. Look what he's lost. He's squandered his inheritance. He may be back home, but it's a long way back to rebuild credit. It's a long way back to rebuild wealth, to buy back the land you squandered, the inheritance you squandered. And I listened to that, and it was almost like a business lecture. And it took a while before I realized, no, he's missed the whole point of the parable. He's missed the whole point. This kid is not only given a robe, and by the way, his dad is. He said, I'm not going to take him home so that the servants will see him walk in his filthy garments. I'm going to make sure when they see him walk in, the first impression is he looks as good as his dad. Why? Because he's wearing the best robe. Not only that, look at that thing on his finger. He's wearing his father's ring. That means he has been restored to his father's line of credit. He has inheritance again. And not only that, put sandals on his feet. You can always tell the poor because they don't have shoes. You can always tell the poor because, well, they're the ones kneeling down and washing the feet of other people. But this kid is walking in, dressed good, looking good, with shoes on his feet, and he's already being restored to the family fortunes. Wow. There's something off about that. And bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. Well, back then they didn't have a deep freeze. I went in the deep freeze here yesterday, got a whole bunch of hamburger out, made some stew. That's the sort of thing I like to do when I'm alone. I'm fairly domesticated. No, it's been there for too long, so I figured we better use it. But they didn't have a deep freeze. But they always kept a goat or a lamb or a calf, something that could be butchered within an hour or two, and you could whip up a banquet on short order. This was their equivalent of the deep freeze. Today we chop it up and put it in, and it's all preserved. But here you could do this. Now we have, hey, just no time at all, we're going to throw a party. We are going to have a banquet. Why? For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and he is found. And so they began to celebrate. See, you can read over that real quickly, but when you return, we are told constantly that to embrace the Father in heaven is to move from death to life. John says, from darkness to light, from being lost, and maybe you didn't even know you were lost, but now you are found. Okay, other analogies, from blindness to sight. There's no sort of progress, there's no working your way back. You're either in the dark, you're either lost or found. You're either righteous or coping by yourself. And the righteousness is the gift of God that is granted by the garment of God, which is what? The righteousness of Jesus. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. He didn't walk in and insert himself into the party and said, what's all this about? I'm feeling tense. I'm feeling distress. What on earth is going on here? I've been out in the field, hot and sticky. I thought I'd come home. Somebody might wash my feet. I might have a quiet dinner. But there's a huge party. And the servant says, your brother has come. Father is safe and sound. So this was the ultimate, the honored guest. You remember the story of Abraham when he's sitting in the shade of his tent, and it tells us that the angel of the Lord comes to him, and they just appear to him and they talk about what's going to happen and so forth. But it says Abraham knows that these are very special people, so he runs to the herd and gets the fatted calf, and he has his servant do certain things real fast, and as a result of that, hey, we have an instant celebration. And this is what's happening. This is extremely different. We don't kill the fatted calf every day. As we say in England, you don't push the boat out every day. You don't throw a party every day. Even for your birthday, it only comes out once a year. But wow, it's midweek, and we're eating and drinking like it's Thanksgiving. What's going on? The older brother becomes angry and refuses to go in, so his father comes out and pleads with him. Now, this is the older brother, and it's pretty obvious who the older brother is in this particular analogy. The older brother is the Pharisee. He is the one who has, quote, done it right, whatever that means. He is the one who has obeyed the law. He is the one who has lived the disciplined life. He's the one who kind of thinks, well, what's the point? But I'm going to do it right. Thank you, Lord, for the rain that falls upon me. And I kind of want to ask you why you let it fall on him. Because he ain't doing what, but the sun shines on him and the rain falls on him. This doesn't feel quite right. And so now the older brother, well, all of his frustrations and misunderstandings and resentments come to the fore. And his dad, who has come out to talk to him and plead with him, gets an earful. Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Again, you read over that quickly and you don't realize what he's saying. You are kind of a hard taskmaster, and I have been just really grinding it out for you. Now, that's, first of all, not the approach that we're encouraged to have towards our Father in heaven. And secondly, it is not the sense to which we have been called. There's apparently not a lot of joy in this individual's relationship with his Father in heaven. But he can stand on his own ideas, his own perceptions, his own righteousness. And now he's asking, what was the point? You never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Now that's his perception. This thankless business of being a Christian, this hard work of being a Christian, this grinding it out. And what's the point of doing that? What's the point of keeping my yard clean on the West End if you can get by living in filth on 97th Street? What's the point? But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. My father said, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. Everything I've had is yours. It's always been there for you, but you failed to recognize it because you were depending on whatever it is you have, whatever it is you did, whatever it is you produce, whatever work you did. And because of that, yeah, there are blessings to righteousness in the here and now. We do tend to reap what we sow, and so let's not forget that little principle. You know, you go out and you, as we say, tie one on. You're going to probably wake up in the morning with a headache. Your father may still love you, but you're going to have a bit of a headache for a while. You dissipate yourself, you are going to have certain physical consequences. We're talking about the Father in heaven. We are talking about the spiritual consequences of relying on your own righteousness and believing that, well, I'm going to suffer now, and I guess eventually I'll inherit. But I really don't like, and of course Jesus goes to some length to explain that, doesn't he? Other parables, he explains how some people work all day, and some people would just work from noon on, and other people may be called late in the day. But he says, you know, they all get the penny. They all get the coin for the experience. And that coin is everlasting life. And it's up to me. And after all, it is my coin I'm giving away. It is my life that I'm giving away. And I will give it away on my own. And you have failed to recognize that you needed my grace just as much as he did. Your attitude is stifling you. You're just missing the whole point here of what it is to know me. Look, your brother came home, and we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead, and now he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found. And that's where it ends. It just dangles there. I've heard it said that this parable is found in other Jewish literature, and that Jesus probably shocked his audience by taking something they knew well and then just reconstructing it. It also said that this can be found in Buddhist literature, but in that particular tradition, the story is told that the king sort of in very, very small increments reveals himself to the lost son. In our tradition, Jesus takes it and he says, I am presenting to you the open-hearted Father who is anxious to see you restored and is watching and waiting and is reaching out to you. And I'm going to leave you with that thought. I am going to restore the dead to life, and the lost shall be found. And what are you going to say about it? I wonder myself, what would you say to the older brother yourself? The older brother who says, this is tough, I got a record. What's his record? I got a track record. I have been righteous. I have invested in my righteousness. You know, some of us could say that, especially those of us who grew up with a bit more of how can I put it, an awareness of Jesus. All right? I became aware of that through my, we were talking about it on Wednesday at our seniors meeting. I can remember my dad and his commitment to Christianity when I was 4 or 5 years of age. And so I grew up in this ambiance. And of course, that was a very compelling thing for my dad because, you know, not too many years before, he was in a war. And he saw the very worst of human behavior. He saw the very most immoral and degenerate behavior. So when he finally got out of his uniform, he married my mother, and he was highly motivated as a young husband, a young father, to seek stability and the grace of God in his life. And that sort of affected me. It shaped my experiences. I never did have to go to war. I never did get dragged through the mud, other than that little smooch I had with the pig. All right, I've never groveled in the dirt and had to compete for carob pods with pigs. On the other hand, what does that make me compared to my other brother who has been through the bush backwards? Does it make me better? Does it make me more worthy? Does it make me more righteous? I hope you see the answer now. On the other hand, how do I see my failures? Because I have had one or two. I'm not going to share them with you because then you'd all know that I failed, and I don't want you to know that. But yeah, there are times when I can look in the mirror and I say, wow, you screwed that one up. Wow, you sure know better and you didn't do. Okay, you sure knew better and you mismanaged. You took resources and you frittered them away. Do you really fathom the depth of God's love for you? Does it make a difference? And if it makes a difference to you, can you sort of share that? Can you give it out? And I find more because it's tradition, as I get older, I do share a little bit more. I went to a memorial graveside just this last Monday for an individual who died a little bit too early. But many years ago, he put the railings in the house that I live in. And so every morning I grab those railings, and they're as solid as when he put them in 21 years ago. And so I have a little bit of a soft spot for Bill. But I got to the graveside first because I was not able to make it to the church service. So I missed a very heartfelt eulogy given by Gary Schultz. A lot of people were really, really touched by the things he had to say about his friend Bill. And but here I am, the place is a sea of mud, and so I pull in my four-wheel drive, park, and a lady who's usher. I'm the first there, so she tells me where to park and everything else. Now she's got 5 minutes to spare, and so she chooses to share with me. And she said, pretty quickly, we're talking about her husband, his prostate cancer, and other things like that, and how old was Bill when he died, and so forth. And how life is hard. And I said, well, yeah, it is, but that's why we need the hope in the next one. And she looked at me and she said, I don't believe that BS. Just like that. Of course, I hadn't revealed to her that I, number one, was not just a believer in that, but also tried to, share it with others from time to time. But she just said that. Now, if you want to believe it, that's fine. But, it's a waste of my time. I'm here for a good time, not a long time, and I'm just going to party in this life as best I can. And then that's, okay? But I have a different view, as do you, a depth and a breadth of God's love. And I also know that as this life comes to an end, whatever the screw-ups, whatever the mess, whatever the lack of righteousness, and the true perspective is we all lack it anyway. The only righteousness that's going to get us anywhere is the righteousness loaned to us, clothed upon us by Jesus' sacrifice that we're coming up on celebrating. But this is simply a transition. Now you've had life, and now comes life everlasting. And the point of this was to kind of get you ready for the real one that's to come, that's to follow. And so we had that little bit of a discussion. But of course, I was cut off short. And I found an opportunity to share that on other occasions with people who, believe it or not, are coming from other cultures and other world religions, and who really clue in very quickly on the fact that Christianity is different. That Christianity has a God that offers this tremendous gift called grace, this tremendous gift called forgiveness that changes our view of ourselves. It brings about relief. It just lifts the burdens. It opens up the path forward. It may not solve every headache, because as long as we're in the flesh, God does not suspend the consequences of ridiculous things we might do. But He forgives them, and He strengthens us, and He empowers us to go through and to be leaders in all things. He leaves us to learn through the battles, because what doesn't kill you will make you stronger, both physically and spiritually. But He will see us through these things. Again, what would you say to the older brother? You have to think about that. Then you also have to think about the fact, have I ever been the older brother? And if you're honest, yeah. I've kind of wondered about the shortcut he seems to be getting. Well, there's no shortcut. We all go through some process or another that brings us to a conviction that we need God's love, His forgiveness, His grace, And we also have to remember that he is the one who clothed us and given us the credit card, the ring, and put the shoes on our feet so that we can come through. And we will not walk back into the house to be looked down upon by the servants. What an incredible gift, and what an incredible story as well. I've not read it for quite a few years, but as I went through and I looked at all the details and the minutiae, I thought, it's no wonder 2,000 years after the fact, we still read this and it still speaks to us. What a brilliant storyteller Jesus was, and what a brilliant story he told in this particular parable. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, today as we reflect on the gift of your compassion and your grace and your mercy, we thank you for it, and we ask that it would change what we see in the mirror and how we feel as we walk through this life, how we feel about ourselves, because we understand how you feel about us. But a step further, please help us to feel that way about others also. Let us never be the older brother. Let us never be the ones who feel as though we've put out so much effort we deserve more than everybody else seems to be collecting too. And we thank you for your compassion and mercy to us personally in Jesus' name. Amen.